Alright, welcome to the Introduction to Web Dev quiz number 5. In this one, we're going to be talking about node.js, Express, server-side programming, local storage, and multer. So let's hop right into it with this first question. What is missing from this chunk of code? And then we've got app.getHello, and then a function with two parameters, rec and res, and we're saying res.send hello. A, using rec, B, the type of response, or C, turning the response into JSON. The correct answer is B. Yeah, so with A, you don't actually need to use the rec parameter. That's for if you have any query parameters, and in your web server, you could just have this as the path. The user doesn't have to provide any parameters. So it's not A. And C, this isn't really actually even Java or JSON, so we wouldn't anticipate having to turn the response into JSON, but we aren't specifying the type of the response. And the reason why that's a bad thing is that by default, the type of the response is text/HTML. So if you were sending back HTML and you wanted your client to use that somehow, that would be good for you. But since we're sending this string hello, what we want to do is we want to specify that it's text. So when the client side receives it, they're gonna get text plain, and not text HTML. So yeah, the type of response is what's missing. Next question. Which of these is not an example of something we would use on the client side? A, HTML, B, CSS, C, Ajax, or D, node.js? Yeah, correct answer is node.js. So, as you might recall, node.js is associated with server-side programming, and the rest of these are associated with client-side. So you would anticipate on the web client using HTML for the structure of the content you see, CSS for the style of the content, and then Ajax if you wanted to, say, for example, fetch something from an API to display that content on your website. This is in direct comparison to the web server, where you're using things like node.js and then middleware like multer and Express. So these are kind of like the two different sides of programming, and it's good to keep them separate in your mind. And like one is good for displaying content, the other one is good for providing content for clients. All right, next question. When using node.js, you have access to constructs like document, window, and add event listener. A, true, B, false. The correct answer is false. Yeah, you don't actually have access to any of these. The reason why is the environment that node.js runs in. So it's a cross-platform runtime environment where you can make these server-side tools and applications, but, and this is a very big but, don't laugh at that, the runtime is intended for use outside of a browser context. So it anticipates that you're running it on a computer or server OS, and for that reason, you don't have these browser-specific JavaScript APIs like document, window, add event listener. So don't be trying to use those constructs in your server-side programming. However, it does add support for some HTTP and file system libraries, which can be useful. So keep those two things separate in your mind. All right, next question. In node.js, for a GET request using route parameters, also known as path parameters, you do not need to check if the parameters exist. A, true, B, false. The correct answer here is true. Yes. So up above, we have an example of route parameters or path parameters, and you can tell that there are parameters within the path, within the routes, because of the syntax. So to get this to request this, you would pass in cats and then some sort of breed. So I really like Scottish folds. They're these cute little cats that have these little folded ears. You should Google them. Let's say we pass it in as like a string with the dash through it. Then you say the age of the cat that you want to see. Maybe this sends you back pictures or something, so let's say like 3. And since you had to have provided those parameters to actually even make it to this endpoint, you don't need to check for their existence. If you had tried to request simply just cats with no breed or no age, you wouldn't make it inside of this endpoint. It would either, I mean, if you had created an endpoint like that, it would go into that function. But if you didn't, they would probably error. So with route parameters or path parameters, you don't need to check for them. You can assume that these exist because you made it to that endpoint function. However, this is in direct comparison with query parameters here on the left, where we've got, we're no longer putting the parameters into the endpoint URL, as you can notice. What we're doing is we're passing them through this request object. Here, let's say, for example, that we're setting this variable breed equal to rec.query.breed. Let's say the user didn't pass in this breed, so we would error on this line. So this is why for query parameters, we actually do want to check that the user passed them in, because, you know, anytime you're sort of developing some sort of anything, you've got to kind of assume that your users can and will do something wrong. So in this case, we can't always assume that they've passed in those query parameters, since it's not the same case as the route parameters. So here, you actually want to put like a if rec.query.breed like exists or like isn't null. And same with rec.query.age, and then you can move on with the rest of your code. All right, next question. Server-side JavaScript is more secure than client-side JavaScript. A, true, B, false. The correct answer here is true. Yeah, so with client-side JavaScript, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you inspect the element on a web page, you can actually see the script tags, and if you click on them, you can see the JavaScript that's running within that page, which is very cool. But hackers have also found out about this, and they have decided that cool things can't last, and here are a series of hacks or no good internet behavior that hackers have come up with for client-side JavaScript. So SQL injections, cross-site scripting, stuff like this. And for that reason, client-side JavaScript, people who write client-side JavaScript had to get smarter and come up with solutions to make their client-side JavaScript not vulnerable to these things. You can't ever have a good thing for that long. This is in comparison to server-side JavaScript, which typically runs on using one of these services. So we've got Heroku, AWS, and DigitalOcean, and it's a little bit harder to actually see the code that's running this because it's inside these softwares, and so there's like some sort of computer or maybe multiple computers that are running your server, and a lot of them are secure, hopefully, you hope, so they aren't vulnerable to these issues. So yeah, server-side JavaScript is more secure than client-side JavaScript.